Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a close look at how architects can manage risk.
Um, yeah,
And it's really about,
we talk about risk a lot in architecture,
we do.
but this is going to be a little bit different.
Yeah,
And we're going to talk to our expert in a second, but I think it's really important to point out that this deep dive is going to be really valuable for all of you,
absolutely.
no matter where you are in your careers.
It doesn't matter how long you've been practicing.
We're going to try to give you some tools and some insights
That's right.
that hopefully you can put to use right away.
Immediately.
So without further ado, let's get into it. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. And I think just to sort of kick things off, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today and why it's so important for architects to understand risk management. Yeah, so I think, for architects, risk management is it's one of those things that people know they should be doing, but they don't really know always how to do it or where to even start.
Right.
And it's something that I think is, especially critical for architects who are, maybe just starting out their own practices or, maybe they're working on larger and more complex projects than they're used to. And so, the stakes are higher.
Yeah, the stakes are higher.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting that you say that because I think, when I was first starting out, risk management is sort of like this abstract concept.
Yeah.
Like I knew it was important,
Yeah.
but I didn't really understand what it meant in practice.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started out, it was like, okay, well, I need to get insurance.
Right.
That's that.
So that box off.
Exactly.
Okay, what else do I need to worry about?
Yeah.
And it turns out it's a lot more than that.
It is a lot more than that.
So maybe we can start by kind of just unpacking some of the basics. Like what are the core elements of risk management for architects?
Sure. So, I think at its heart, risk management is really about
Mm-hmm.
identifying the potential risks that you face as an architect
Mm-hmm.
and then developing strategies to either mitigate or avoid those risks.
Okay.
And so that could involve things like, carefully vetting your clients.
So you're saying we need to actually be picky about who we work with.
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, having solid contracts in place, making sure that your designs are, well coordinated and meet all the applicable building codes and standards. And
So basically every stage of a project
every stage,
from the very beginning
from the very beginning
and very
to
end
the very end.
has potential risks that need to be carefully considered.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, the important thing to keep in mind is that, you're never going to be able to eliminate all risks entirely. There's always going to be some level of risk involved in any project.
Sure.
But the goal is to minimize those risks to a level that you're comfortable with.
That's manageable.
That's manageable, exactly.
Okay. So I think it's clear that risk management is a big topic.
Yeah, it's big.
And we're not going to be able to cover everything today.
No.
So we're going to have to kind of pick and choose our battles a little bit.
Okay.
But I think a good place to start is with something that you mentioned earlier, which is client selection.
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
Because I think a lot of times, especially for architects who are just starting out,
Yeah.
they're so eager to get any project.
Get work in the door.
They're not always thinking critically about who they're working with.
Exactly.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Like, why is client selection so important from a risk management perspective?
Well, I think the biggest reason is that, the client is really the one who's ultimately driving the project.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who are setting the budget, the timeline, and they're the ones who are ultimately going to be responsible for paying you.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're working with a client who is, difficult to work with or who has a history of not paying their bills or who is constantly changing their mind,
Oh, yeah.
that can create a lot of risk for you as an architect.
Yeah. It can turn into a real nightmare.
It can turn into a nightmare.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because I think a lot of architects, they think of, risk management in terms of like legal risks or financial risks.
Right.
But I think what you're getting at is that there's also
Oh, yeah.
emotional risks.
Absolutely.
And, your time
Absolutely.
is valuable.
It is.
And if you're spending all your time dealing with a difficult client,
Yeah,
that's time that you're not spending on other things.
exactly. And that you're not getting paid for.
Exactly. Yeah. So what are some of the things that architects can do to sort of vet their clients and make sure that they're working with people who are going to be a good fit?
Yeah. So, I think the first thing is to just do your research.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to other architects who've worked with this client before.
Word of mouth.
Word of mouth, exactly.
Yeah.
Check their references.
Okay.
See if there are any online reviews.
And it's so easy these days to do a quick Google search.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And find out.
Especially if they've had some legal issues in the past.
Yeah.
It's all going to be out there.
Right. So you're saying do your due diligence.
Exactly. I think it's also important to just have a conversation with the client up front about their expectations for the project and about your process and your fees.
Okay.
And just make sure that you're on the same page.
So being really clear about how you work,
exactly,
what you charge, and what the client can expect from you.
Right. And I think that's especially important when you're working with a new client because you don't have that existing relationship.
Right. You haven't sort of built up that trust yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one thing that I always recommend to architects is to have what's called a go-no-go checklist.
Okay. What is that?
So this is basically just a list of criteria that you can use to evaluate potential projects.
Okay.
And it can include things like, the type of project, the size of the project, the budget, the location.
For client's reputation.
The client's reputation, exactly. And so, before you even agree to take on a project, you go through this checklist and you see if it meets all of your criteria.
So it's like a little quiz you give yourself.
Exactly.
Before you jump in.
Yeah.
And I love that you said go-no-go checklist because I think there's this misconception out there that if something doesn't meet all your criteria, you just have to say no.
Right. But necessarily.
Doesn't always have to be a hard no.
It doesn't,
right.
No. So maybe it can be a starting point for a negotiation.
Right.
So if there are some things on the checklist that, are maybe giving you some pause, you can use that as an opportunity to talk to the client and say, hey, I'm a little bit concerned about this, that, or the other thing. Is there a way that we can address this?
So it's about having those tough conversations up front.
Exactly.
Rather than
waiting till later.
Trying to fix things.
Yeah.
After they've already gone wrong.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's great advice. And I think, we're already starting to see that risk management is really about being proactive.
Yeah.
It's about thinking ahead.
Planning.
And anticipating potential problems.
Absolutely.
Rather than just reacting to them.
Yeah, it's not about being, paranoid.
Right.
It's about,
hiding in a corner afraid of every project.
Right. It's just about being, prepared. And having a plan.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of talked about client selection, maybe we can move on to another really important aspect of risk management, which is client-architect agreements.
Yeah, the contracts.
The contracts, yeah.
So that's why the rubber hits the road, right?
That's where it all gets put down in writing.
Exactly.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. Like, why are contracts so important from a risk management perspective?
Well, I think the biggest reason is that the contract really defines the relationship between you and the client. It outlines your scope of services, your fees, your responsibility.
And the client's responsibility.
Yeah, the client's responsibilities, exactly.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have a solid contract in place, you're really opening yourself up to all sorts of potential problems.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, it could be anything from scope creep.
Where the client keeps adding more and more work?
Exout out any additional compensation. Exactly. To disputes over payment, to even claims of negligence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's really important to have a contract that is, clear, concise, and that protects your interests.
So are you saying that architects should always have a lawyer review their contracts?
I think that's always a good idea, especially if you're working on a larger or more complex project or if you're working with a new client. Because a lawyer can help you to identify any potential red flags in the contract.
And, make sure that your interests are protected.
Exactly. And, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the contract is a living document.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not something that you just sign at the beginning of the project and then forget about.
You have to refer back to it.
You have to refer back to it. You have to update it as the project goes on.
So if there are any changes to the scope of work or to the timeline or the budget,
those need to be documented in the contract.
In writing.
In writing.
Okay, yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of architects forget to do. They just get so caught up in the day-to-day of the project.
Right. Getting the work done.
That they forget to keep the contract updated.
Right. And then they run into problems down the road.
Exactly. Yeah. And then it becomes a he said, she said type of situation.
Right.
Which is never good.
No, it's not good.
So
what are some of the key things that architects should look for in a client-architect agreement? Like, what are some of the must-haves?
Well, I think, first and foremost, you need to make sure that the contract clearly defines your scope of services.
Okay.
What are you responsible for? What are you not responsible for?
What are the client's responsibilities?
What are the client's responsibilities? Exactly.
Okay.
It's also important to have a clear payment schedule
Okay.
that outlines when you're going to get paid,
Mm-hmm.
how much you're going to get paid,
How those payments are going to be made.
and what happens if the client doesn't pay on time.
Right. Because those things happen.
They do happen.
So you have to be prepared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another important thing to look for is what's called an indemnity clause.
Okay. I've heard of those, but I don't really know what they are.
Okay, so an indemnity clause is basically
Mhm.
a provision in the contract that protects you
Okay.
from liability for certain things.
Okay.
So, for example, if the client hires a contractor
Mm-hmm.
and the contractor does something negligent,
Mm-hmm.
an indemnity clause would protect you from being held liable for the contractor's negligence.
So it's like a shield
It's like a shield, exactly.
that protects you
Protects you
from things that
that are outside of your control.
are outside of your control.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying that contracts are really important
They are.
and they can be quite complex.
They can be.
And so it's always a good idea to have a lawyer review them
Absolutely.
before you sign anything.
Before you sign anything.
Yeah.
And, I think it's also important to just remember that the contract is a tool.
Okay.
It's a tool that can be used to protect you and to make sure that the project runs smoothly.
But it's not a weapon.
It's not a weapon.
Right.
No.
It's not something that you should use to try to take advantage of the client
Exactly.
or to get into a fight with them.
Yeah, it should be a collaborative document.
It should be a collaborative document.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That everyone agrees on and that everyone understands.
That's a really good point. And I think that's a good place to maybe wrap up this first part
Yeah.
of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
So
Yeah.
we've talked about client selection, client architect agreements,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of really important information,
A lot to digest.
and a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to dive into some of the other key aspects of risk management for architects.
Sounds good.
So stay tuned. Yeah. So let's dig into this whole dispute thing a little more.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Because I know for me, it's one of those things that, you hope it never happens.
You just cross your fingers and hope.
But you kind of know deep
It's
down.
the back of your mind.
It's probably going to at some point.
It's a matter of when, not if.
Right. So what are, some of the early warning signs that a project's headed for trouble? Like, what are the things that make you go, uh-oh, this doesn't feel right?
Well, sometimes it can be pretty subtle, It's not always like fireworks and screaming matches.
Right. It's not always a dramatic blow-up.
Exactly. But you start to pick up on these, little red flags. Maybe there's a lot of back and forth on emails.
Oh, yeah. The email chains start getting longer.
Endless email chains, right. And the tone starts to get a little tense.
Okay. So communication starts to break down.
Yeah. And you might notice the client's getting a little more hesitant to sign off on things.
Oh, yeah. The approval starts slowing down.
Yeah, exactly. And you might start feeling like you're walking on eggshells a bit.
Okay. So there's this, growing tension in the air.
Yeah. And that's usually a sign that something's brewing.
So let's say you're picking up on these vibes.
Mm-hmm.
What's the first thing you should do? Is it time to call in the lawyers?
Whoa, hold on there. Not so fast.
Okay, so maybe not lawyers right away.
Right. I mean, lawyers definitely have their place, but they're not always the first solution.
So what should be the first move?
Well, the most important thing is to try to nip it in the bud early on.
Okay, so address it head on.
Exactly. Have a frank conversation with the client. Try to figure out what's causing the friction.
So communication is key, even when things are getting a little tough.
Especially when things are getting tough. Sometimes it's just a simple misunderstanding that can be cleared up with a good conversation.
Right, maybe they're feeling like they're not being heard, or they're worried about something that you can easily address.
Exactly. And even if it's something more serious, like a disagreement over the scope of work, having that open dialogue can help you find a solution that works for both sides.
So it's about finding common ground, even when there's disagreement.
Exactly. We're all on the same team, ultimately. Right. We want the project to be a success.
Right, you're both working towards the same goal.
Yeah, and sometimes just reminding each other that can help diffuse the tension.
Now, let's say you've tried the open communication route, and it's not really working. The situation's still pretty tense. What are some other options?
Well, this is where those other dispute resolution methods come in, like mediation or arbitration.
Okay, so those are the tools we can use when things escalate a bit.
Right. And the good news is these methods can be much less adversarial and way more cost-effective than going to court.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about how mediation works.
Sure. So with mediation, you bring in a neutral third party, the mediator, who helps facilitate a conversation between you and the client.
So it's like having a referee, but not one who makes the final call.
Exactly. The mediator's not there to judge or make decisions. Their role is to guide the conversation, help you understand each other's perspectives, and hopefully find a solution that works for everyone.
So it's more about finding common ground than, like, proving who's right or wrong.
Right. It's about finding a way to move forward together.
And what about arbitration? How is that different?
Arbitration is a bit more formal. You still have a neutral third party, the arbitrator, but this time they actually do make the final decision.
So it's more like a mini trial, but outside of the courtroom?
Yeah, you could say that. You present your case to the arbitrator, they hear both sides, and then they issue a ruling that's legally binding.
Okay, so it's a bit more serious, and there's a definitive outcome.
Right. And because it's a more structured process, it can be a good option if the dispute involves complex legal or technical issues.
So it's like having a judge who actually understands the intricacies of architecture and construction.
Exactly. And often, the arbitrator is someone who has expertise in the field, which can be really valuable in getting to the heart of the matter.
Now, I know we're focusing a lot on the mechanics of dispute resolution, but I think it's important to acknowledge the emotional side of things, too.
Oh, absolutely. Disputes can be incredibly stressful, both for the architect and the client.
Yeah, it's not just about contracts and deadlines. There are real relationships and emotions involved.
Exactly. And when a dispute arises, it can feel very personal, even if it's really about a technical issue or a misunderstanding.
So what are some strategies for, like, staying sane and keeping your cool when things get heated?
Well, first of all, remember that you're not alone. Every architect goes through this at some point in their career.
Okay, so it's normal to feel stressed and overwhelmed.
Totally normal. And it's important to reach out for support. Talk to your colleagues, your mentors, your friends, or even a therapist if you need to.
So having a strong support system is key.
Absolutely. And make sure you're taking care of yourself too. Get enough sleep, eat healthy food, exercise, do things that help you relax and de-stress.
Right, because if you're not taking care of yourself, it's hard to deal with anything, let alone a dispute.
Exactly. You need to be at your best, both mentally and physically, to navigate these challenges effectively.
That's great advice. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, partnering. It seems like such a different approach to risk management, so tell me more about how it works.
Sure. So, partnering is all about building a strong collaborative relationship between the architect, the client, and the contractor from the very beginning of the project.
Okay, so it's like you're all in it together right from the start.
Exactly. Instead of seeing each other as potential adversaries, you're working together as a team with a shared goal of making the project a success.
So how does that actually play out in practice?
Well, it often involves having workshops and team building exercises early on to establish trust and open communication.
So it's about building those relationships before any problems arise.
Exactly. And it also involves having regular meetings throughout the project to discuss progress, address concerns, and make decisions collaboratively.
So it's about staying in constant communication and being proactive.
Exactly. And by doing that, you can often avoid those little misunderstandings and disagreements that can escalate into bigger problems down the road.
It sounds like a really positive approach to risk management. So, if partnering is about preventing disputes, what happens when those efforts fail and a dispute does arise?
Well, that's where those more formal dispute resolution methods come in, like the mediation and arbitration we talked about earlier.
Okay, so it's like having a backup plan just in case.
Exactly. But even if you end up needing to use those tools, having that foundation of trust and open communication from the partnering process can make a huge difference in how smoothly the dispute is resolved.
So it's like, even if you hit a bump in the road, you're still all in the same car trying to get to the same destination.
Exactly. And that's what it's all about, right? Working together to create a successful project, even when challenges arise.
That's a great way to put it. So we've covered a lot of ground in this part, from the early warning signs of disputes to the various methods of resolution and the importance of partnering and self-care. It's been a really insightful conversation.
I'm glad you found it helpful.
Now, in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to step outside our comfort zones and explore the exciting and sometimes daunting world of working on projects across borders.
It's a whole new level of adventure with its own unique set of risks and rewards.
So join us as we navigate the complexities of international practice and uncover the strategies for success in this ever-evolving global landscape. All right, we're back and ready to tackle this whole international architecture thing.
Passport ready.
Passport ready, metaphorically at least.
Good, because things can get pretty interesting when you start working across borders.
That's what I'm hearing. So let's break it down. What are some of the biggest differences architects face when they take on projects in a new country?
Well, obviously there are the language and cultural differences. Those are pretty much a given.
Right, different ways of communicating, different customs.
Exactly. And you have to be sensitive to that. But what a lot of architects don't realize is that the biggest hurdle is often the legal and regulatory stuff.
Oh, right, like building codes and all that?
Yeah, building codes, permitting processes, professional practice standards, it can all be completely different from what you're used to.
So it's not just about designing a building that works. It's about making sure it meets all these different rules.
Exactly. And it can get pretty complex. Like in some countries, you might need to get approvals from multiple government agencies.
Wow, that sounds like a headache.
It can be. And if you don't do your homework up front, you can end up with some major delays and cost overruns.
So how do you even begin to get your head around all these different regulations?
Well, research is key. Talk to local architects, lawyers, consultants, anyone who has experience working in that country.
So it's like, find yourself a good guide.
Exactly. Someone who can help you navigate the system and avoid any major pitfalls.
And what about insurance? Does your regular professional liability insurance cover you when you're working abroad?
That's a great question. And the answer is, it depends. Some policies might extend coverage to international projects, but others might not.
So you definitely have to check the fine print.
Absolutely. And you might need to get additional coverage or a separate policy altogether.
Okay, so lots to think about on the legal and insurance front. Now let's talk about those language and cultural differences.
Yeah, that's where things can get really interesting.
I bet. So how do you make sure everyone's on the same page when you're literally speaking different languages?
Well, sometimes you need to bring in professional translators or interpreters,
Makes sense.
especially for important meetings or contract negotiations.
Right, you don't want any misunderstandings there.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just the words, You have to be aware of different communication styles, body language, all those nonverbal cues.
Oh, right, like some cultures are more direct while others are more subtle.
Exactly. And what might be considered polite in one culture could be seen as rude in another.
So it's a lot of learning on the fly, adapting to the situation.
It is. And it's about being respectful, asking questions, and being willing to learn from your local colleagues.
It sounds like building relationships is a huge part of international work.
It is. When you have that trust and rapport, it makes everything so much smoother.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal stuff, the cultural stuff. Now, what about the money? How do you handle payments and currency exchange when you're working across borders?
Well, again, it all comes down to having clear agreements in place. Your contract should specify the currency of payment, the exchange rate to be used, and how the money will be transferred.
So no surprises there.
Right. And you also have to think about currency fluctuations. Exchange rates can change a lot, and that can impact your profitability.
Yeah, that's an added layer of risk.
It is. So you might want to consult with a financial advisor who can help you mitigate that risk.
So it's like international work is architecture plus a whole bunch of other stuff.
It is. It's challenging, but it can also be incredibly rewarding.
I bet. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what's your biggest piece of advice for architects who are thinking about taking their practice global?
Do your research. Seriously, don't underestimate the importance of understanding the local context. Talk to people, read up on the laws and regulations, visit the place if you can.
So it's about being prepared.
Absolutely. And be open to learning. You're going to encounter new ways of doing things, new perspectives, and that can be really enriching, both personally and professionally.
That's great advice. Well, this has been an amazing journey exploring all these different facets of risk management.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights.
And a huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this complex world.
You're very welcome.
And to all our listeners out there, whether you're designing skyscrapers in Dubai or renovating brownstones in Brooklyn, remember that knowledge is power.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So stay curious, stay informed, and keep those creative sparks flying. And that's a wrap on the deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.